we'll have 2 sessions in a row. So we're now having a session in honor of Aloisio Araujo for his birthday. And then we'll have our closing lecture by Professor Pierre-André Chiappori. Before starting this session, let me tell a brief story. When we started to plan this conference, we asked about like names for plenary talks that were somehow connected to Brazil and to FGV, and a name that came to our mind quite quickly was Professor James Heckman, because he was professor of many of our colleagues at the school, and because he has a lot of interest in Brazil and coming to Brazil for many times. And we invited him, he agreed to come, we make it public on the internet, and at the last month there was a family issue that he couldn't make it, and nothing serious, thanks God. But he had to cancel his visit to Brazil. And last Friday he sent us a video that wasn't planned, but we thought that this was a nice time to show the video. So we'll start this session with a video. It's a short video, 7 minutes video by Professor James Heckman, and then we follow what was planned. Pierre-André will introduce Aloisio, and Aloisio will deliver some words.
Okay, so I want to express my regrets for not being able to be with you today to honor Aloisio Araujo, who's been a good friend of mine for over 40 years, and a person from whom I've learned a great deal, and whom I greatly respect, not only for his work in economic theory and for his work on economic policy, but also as a decent human being and as a friend in many areas over the past decades. Aloisio, as you all know, is a very rigorous and well-trained economist. He started out life as a probabilist, and he wrote the classic book on probability theory in Banach spaces, the central limit theorem in Banach spaces, a co-authored book. And this book, when I first encountered it many years ago, I found quite stimulating and, to be honest, very challenging. But I also found that Aloisio branched out considerably from that book, even though the book itself has had, I think, an important role in statistics. And I think what I learned from Aloisio is really his contributions in economics and economic policy. Now, it turned out that I was very fortunate when I first came to the University of Chicago to have Jose Schenkman as a colleague of mine, and Jose and Aloisio had gone to school together and were good friends together. In fact, I believe it was Jose who introduced me to Aloisio at Berkeley. I think it was in 1974, when he was still a student in probability theory. But what I found over the years and in my interactions with Aloisio at Chicago and his frequent visits was not only his warmth as a person and his congeniality and his wisdom on a lot of practical matters and public policy matters, but also that his profound understanding of many basic economic concepts. So, for example, when I first became aware of his work, it was on his work on dynamics that he did with Jose, looking at transversality conditions and infinite horizon models, looking at dynamics in a very general way. But then also, I found very helpful his research on general equilibrium theory, and especially general equilibrium theory with infinitely many commodities. Again, a technically challenging problem, but a problem that actually has a lot of practical applications in looking at models with differentiated products and just understanding the nature of heterogeneity that's out there in the markets. I've also learned a great deal from Aloisio's work on a number of other areas. In particular, I think his work, for example, on bankruptcy, not only the theoretical work, but the applied work, I know has had a major impact in the sense of influencing and helping to shape the redesign of Brazilian bankruptcy law. I think this is an amazing accomplishment for a person who started out really almost as a pure, or at least as a very, very high level applied mathematician in probability theory, and I would argue probably a pure theorist, that he learned an enormous amount of economics and contributed to economics. So his work on bankruptcy, and then his work on collateral constraints, and a whole series of his papers that have grown out of his varied interests have been always a source of stimulation to me and to my colleagues when here at the University of Chicago when Aloisio visits and explains the work. I think some of the most interesting work that was done on collateral and the value of collateral and the value of bankruptcy and thinking about what the assets' values are even after bankruptcy occurs. I think these things are really important contributions, especially in light of work that had ignored what I think were some pretty fundamental aspects of the bankruptcy problem. We also know that Aloisio has made major contributions in contracting, contract theory. For example, his notion of generalizing the single crossing property as a central property in contract theory. These contributions are all very fundamental. I should also point out, though, that Aloisio has made major contributions, not just in his own technical papers, and these are serious, world-class contributions that have been recognized by major organizations like the American Academy and the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S. have elevated him to being a foreign associate, which is a high honor, a recognition of his work as a technical economist of international stature. He also received a number of other honors and well-deserved honors. And I think the contribution has come not just for the technical work, but has also come for his organizational role in shaping economics in Brazil, and for that matter, in building up the Latin American Econometric Society and the study of econometrics and economics more generally in Latin America. Aloisio has been a faithful attendee and organizer of very important and very useful meetings at the of the Econometric Society in Latin America. And he has not only organized really wonderful meetings from which I've learned a great deal, but in addition, he's also participated in meetings organized by others, but in supporting that activity, in supporting economic science in Latin America. Aloisio is a really important economist, and I think that he deserves every bit of praise that will be heaped on him at these meetings in his honor, and I'm personally very sorry that I'm not able to give him these words in person and to say it in person and to present a technical paper in his honor. But I hope with this video that I can at least communicate, not just on my behalf, but on behalf of many of my colleagues at the University of Chicago who value him highly, to wish him the best and to hope that 10 years from now, when we celebrate his 80th birthday as a productive academic leader in Brazil, as a scholar, distinguished scholar at Vargas and also at IMPA, that we can toast him again for another decade of distinguished contributions to economics, to social science, and to public policy. Thank you.
I've been asked to introduce Aloisio. It's an honor, it's a pleasure, and it's completely unneeded. If there is someone in this room who doesn't need to be introduced, it's Aloisio, especially after the introduction given by Jim a minute ago. But anyway, I'm given the opportunity to talk about a friend, and that's a beautiful thing, and I'm very happy to grab this opportunity, but it will be more of a subjective presentation. It's the way I know Aloisio. So let me start by how we met. And actually, Aloisio was and still is a mathematician. That's pretty clear. I was also trained as a mathematician. We belong to the same sub-tribe, which is the sub-tribe of applied mathematician. And, you know, according to the definition of my pure mathematician colleagues. Anybody who's not doing either geometry or number theory is an applied guy, so it's a kind of large tribe. But within this tribe, there are very strong connection between France and Brazil. I don't know exactly why historically, but just to give you one example, there is this classmate of mine. He didn't switch to economics. He stayed a mathematician, and he succeeded reasonably well as a mathematician. He went all the way to the Field Medal, and he had a very close connection with IMPA. Actually, he used to spend several months, to spend several months at IMPA, and I don't know if he's still doing this. And recently, there was this young guy who's, as far as I know, is Avila, who's both French and Brazilian, who got the Field Medal, and was also related to IMPA. So that, in a sense, my first connection was with Aloisio, and probably through José Schenkman was as a mathematician. Now that said, of course, Aloisio is a theorist. He is a deep abstract theorist, but one thing that stands out is he's not afraid of tackling real life practical issues, and that's something very uncommon. Well, for one thing, Aloisio is not afraid of much. For instance, the literature on adverse selection, 90% of it assume a single crossing property just because it's much simpler to analyze. Sure enough, Aloisio's contribution with Umberto would be, let's look at the difficult case, which is we don't have single crossing and it can cross several times, and then we have, and it's much more complex on the other thing. On the other hand, it's much more interesting, and I think that might be his mathematical culture that's coming out of it, that we should not be afraid of what's difficult. On the contrary, maybe often what's interesting is exactly there. Now, this kind of boldness is not uncommon among theorists. But one thing that's really uncommon among theorists is writing practical recommendations and report and giving advices on real-life topics. And actually, Aloisio has contributed to a bunch of them. He has studied debt. He has talked about inflation. But let me just mention two examples which I found extremely interesting. One is auction theory. Aloisio and his colleagues have worked on auction in general, but in particular on a particular auction that took place in Brazil. And when a theorist looks at a real-life mechanism like this, he asks the question of a theorist. For instance, do we have existence of an equilibrium strategy? And of course, in auction, you want the equilibrium strategy to be in pure strategy. The mixed strategy in auction doesn't mean much in practical terms. Well, it turns out, as Aloisio and his colleagues showed, that in this particular mechanism, there was no equilibrium in pure strategy. That's typically the kind of very severe weakness of a mechanism that you cannot spot unless you're a theorist and unless you approach this problem as a theorist. And of course, the second contribution, which impressed me even more, is Aloisio's contribution to bankruptcy. Now, we all know as economists that a very important condition for economic growth and progress is what we call vaguely the rule of law. But what Aloisio convinced me of is that among those various aspects, a very important one is bankruptcy. Now, it's not that a good bankruptcy law will cause growth by itself, but it's certainly the case that a poorly designed bankruptcy law might be a huge handicap for economic activity. Not only in Brazil, actually. I recently discussed with my former colleague, Raghu Rajan, who is now the governor of the Central Bank of India, and India has pretty much the same problem. The very weak or inadequate bankruptcy law, and they view this as a cost. Now, one thing I admire a lot with Aloisio is that on the one hand, he has this path-breaking contribution on general equilibrium with default, but on the other hand, he's willing to get out of the ivory tower and write a report on what particular aspect the bankruptcy law reform should take. And those issues, like the bankruptcy law, they are extremely technical, and there is a huge danger to get lost in the technical details and to lose the big picture. The bottom line problem. Well, precisely because he's a theorist, that's exactly what will not happen. Last but not least, one thing that really characterizes Aloisio is how Brazilian he is. He's all over the place, right? Usually we meet in the US, in Europe, wherever. But he is just as Brazilian as ever. He likes Brazilian music, including chorinho that I discovered thanks to him. He is quite intense when he talks about Brazilian politics, aren't we all? But the one thing, if you want to realize how Brazilian Aloisio is, talk with him about football, which is something which in basically every civilized language translates into football, and in American it translates into soccer. The one moment in my life where I almost lost all respect from Aloisio were the moment where I suggested, I fully realized now that it was very stupid. I submitted the idea that we might maybe consider the notion that in the history of football, maybe in terms of stature, Maradona was not that far from Pelé. You don't go there. He was obviously completely amazed that I could make this kind of lose completely the scale, the real scale of values and everything. Now, as being also a supporter of a national team, we know that it can be rewarding, but not always, that it can sometimes be painful. So we decided that we were not going to talk about the recent European Championship or the recent Copa America. And I'm not going to talk about this. Although you still have to admit that at least we made it to the final. Okay, finally, there are plenty of other things to say about Aloisio. He likes good food, he likes good wine, and he married a wife whose first name is Christina, and we all know that those are clear indicators of good taste and wisdom. But of course, even more important than this, is a very charming and one person, and he's a wonderful friend. So happy birthday, Aloisio, and you got the floor.
After so many things, I mean, I feel emotion. I cannot say much. But Brido and Umberto asked me to talk a little bit, not about my research, but the way I looked strategically, how economic, how science. So I tell just a few words about, sorry about it to be a very local thing, but it applies to other countries also. So it's, I decided to do economics, I liked economics, although all my colleagues in high school went to engineers. So I felt a little guilty. Oh, why did I choose? I was not that good student, but that was okay. It was a very good high school. Everybody went to engineers. So I decided to do economics. You're not that serious if you look to economics. And I felt a guilty. I want to learn mathematics. But also, soon, there was this idea in economics university that you should learn mathematics. And that was, I think, a very wise movement. I had a good friend, Federico Carvalho. After each 10 years, I convinced him to have dinner with me. So I asked him to come here, but he just disappeared. And then with Federico, we went to several places to find good mathematics, and then went up doing very crazy things until we find IMPA. That was, and then we learn about some course in IMPA, and then put an ad. And then José saw the ad, José Schenkman, and then he showed there on the first day, and then we've been friends since then. I was already in the second year, and then, so I was doing statistics in the morning, IMPA in the afternoon. No, sorry, economics in the morning, IMPA in the afternoon, and statistics evening. So I was like busy. But soon enough, if you do IMPA, mathematics, all the course in economics was so easy. that I was teaching the professors, because they just put. So I believe that mathematics was useful to learn macro, to learn everything. So that was convincing even further. But I was influenced a lot by some physicists that decided to do their career in Brazil. It's not only because Brazil is like different than soccer, because there was a social duty, because the country was illiterate, there was nothing going on, and then if you do science in your country, in a middle income, middle to low income like Brazil was, and very poorly, the economic school was awful. I cannot describe it. The type of course that you had there was so bad. There was no human capital. And then to look at these physicists, they're very high-level physicists. They were the structure of matter, doing high-level research. And they almost got a Nobel Prize. One of them should deserve. The judges hadn't given only to 3. He was the 4th that they were younger, although he was. So he didn't get a Nobel Prize. So really, really high-level people. They decided to do their career in Brazil. Leite Lopes and César Lattes, among others. So I said, you should do the same thing in Brazil. But for me, given this bad economics that you had in school, economics is something that you should do in the evening. After dinner, you read a little bit, and then that's it. That was the idea. Brazil, you cannot believe that was the best economics university. That's the type of idea that you had. It was totally ignorance, no? Even to take a good linear algebra, you had to go to IMPA. See this. So you cannot imagine the level of unsatisfactory teaching. So I decided to do, no, I'm going to do my career in mathematics and in Brazil. So I went to do probability theory in Berkeley. But when I arrived in Berkeley, there was the Bro seminar. And then I was looking around, come on, economics. It's not exactly what I thought it was. A little different. And then, and the Bro seminar, you had David Gale, Steve Simeo, Roy Radner, Harsani, I probably missing McFadden. Soon enough, Mascolel came there. And I thought, come on, this is tough, hard stuff. I mean, this is very interesting and difficult, no? So I wanted to switch from probability. And I still had this idea, I should do that as a science in Brazil, but not probability alone, but economics, theoretical economics. And then José Schenkman invited me to spend some time in Chicago, and then I was a very good friend of Brock also. And then Luca was turning Chicago into a more mathematical place. I had a hard time because 1 year both of them left, and I was there with everybody that was against it. But it was not that easy. And I was teaching economics. And then there was a third thing there, this idea of applied economics, taking applied economics seriously. So I decided, no, I'm going to stop probability, wrote a few papers and a book, and then just doing between theory, but with the idea that applied economics was good. So that was my forming years. So I came back to Brazil, and I was lucky because there was a pressure. Steve Simeo was pressure in IMPA. He was very connected with IMPA. And then he wanted to do mathematical economics at IMPA because this old mathematician that influenced me a lot, like Peixoto, Palles, they want to have, and they say, Aloisio, either do now or never. So I decided to come back because after so many things, I want to stay a little longer in the US to learn more. These other applied economics. But then I say, no, I don't want to miss this chance. And my wife also wanted to come back. And my project was to come back, do like César Lattes and in my own small world. That was economics. So I came back to IMPA, and then they opened. So I started a master's program in mathematical economics, very small. Monteiro was my first PhD student. That was very lucky. He spoiled me because after that I had 40 so far, but it started very high. And then my first class there, before Monteiro even, as a master student, was Carlos Ivan, that is the president of Getúlio Vargas, Sérgio Verlang, you all know, from decision theory, and then become a very important policymaker. And Ricardo Paz Barro. I think got a PhD with Heckman, and then become the main labor economist, talking about income poverty, income distribution, poverty, and how important education is for economics, that people didn't believe in these things. Ricardo and Sergio gave a very nice presentation about me, and they were so nice, in IMPA last Saturday. And then I said, after these 3 students, I could have retired, but because they had enormous influence in Brazil. But so I continued to do that. And then I love science. I forgot about probability. I was doing general equilibrium, first in infinite dimension, because that was people doing that in Berkeley, and that was natural. I had it in functionality, and then background. And then I was working with Schenkman in dynamic economics. Anyhow, I don't want to talk specifically about my research agenda, but while I was honored to be giving a talk in economics about I decided to prepare something. I don't have the numbers here, okay? And I put that as a challenge for somebody like empirical. Ricardo Paz Barro actually did some empirical work on my work. He said that my work was very bad for science in Brazil, because even if the science was not being supported very much, I continued to do the same thing, so it had no effect on productivity. But anyhow, I did prepare some data on that occasion, about 10 years ago, and then I compare physics, mathematics, and economics in Brazil. And then compare Brazil against developed country, US, France, I think, and England. I forgot countries. And compare Brazil and Argentina and Chile. Compare with the US, so Brazil was much behind everything, but comparing economics, the US, and compare with Europe, England and France, in economics we're much more behind. You see how my criteria, how many papers you have written based on the country. And with Latin America was surprising, because we're way ahead in mathematics and physics compared to Argentina and Chile, but we're way behind in economics. Way behind Argentina and Chile. There are many more papers written in Argentina and Chile in economics than in Brazil. Brazil was strange, because big countries tend to look economics at their own math. They're so big, we solve a problem. Somebody did some empirical work, because economists in Brazil just cite themselves. They don't have interaction with the rest of the world. So that was what I was trying to do, to put. And what I'm saying is not nationalistic, because I think that relate with economic growth, relate with poverty and so forth. I think should do that for other countries, and then all the science, but particularly economics. Economics is very concentrated in the US and a few countries in Europe. Mathematics is more dispersed. So it's a challenge now to do empirical work. How are we doing now? I think we're doing better, at least. In Latin America, Brazil, Getúlio Vargas is the #1 according to Tilburg. So I think it will be interesting to look these comparatives. The index of constant, the Gini coefficient in economics is much worse in general than in any other science. And I believe in economics. I think that has an impact on countries. And so, so that's more or less what I want to say. But just to finish, I think that in Brazil now there are more people doing research. There are very smart people that came back and then doing. I don't mind if somebody stay in the end. Science is universal, but as long as some of them come back, you see what I mean. You have to have some science done here. It's not that it's xenophoby. some people stay, and then but some people come, and then you should have this flow. But we are in the third stage now, and a different stage now, my view, is that you have to start thinking about problems. Economics is going more applied. There's some specific problems to different countries. And then we've been doing some work here. For example, dollarization. I was able to write this paper about auction, that invent an auction in Brazil, so we do a scientific work. It's not that simple. I mean, I did with Paulo Monteiro. And then another paper on inflation targeting. If you have a weak fiscal situation, it might be a speculative attack against you if you put your inflation target too low. So the paper that's coming in International Economic Review. There was another paper in June, International Economics, with Marcia Leon that's there. She's the leader in this research because people want to dollarize Brazil. And most economists say, yes, dollarize, you bring stability, macro stability, and that's it. And then say, no, the country didn't dollarize because of us, because I'm sure that the people didn't want to dollarize. But Argentina dollarized, and it was a disaster. And so to write a good model, no, and more recent, given Greece, they were interested in our work because we had something about common currency also, monetary zones. So to think something like this, is it good dollarize or not? I mean, to think about some issues, you need theorists. It's not only Brazil. People doing a lot of that in the US is good. I mean, you develop so much theoretical background. People are using it to very specific. And so this is a new thing. It's not only publishing good journal, that's good, but also publishing good journal questions that arrive naturally in your specific institutional. And that's it's not only for Brazil, but for in public economic theory, for example, and then Association of Public Economic Theory is very spread out, no? And different countries, different regions have a little different word. I'm totally against what traditional people had in Brazil. Forget about economics, the purely regional, depend on history and so forth. Forget about theory. No, I love theory. But there is some specificity that you have to take in account for. And if you don't have a mass of people thinking about this question, you're in bad shape. It's not only going to the newspaper and saying something or doing simple regression. That's fine also. I have nothing against it. But there's some question more deeper, right? If you look in the US now, there are zillions of very smart people thinking about concrete, no? You work with Pierre-André, this matching and so forth. I mean, there's a policy question that you should have that everywhere in the world. So that you create a huge demand for us. So it's a good propaganda for us. And public economic theory also. You cannot just borrow. Okay, you're not going to recreate the whole economic theory. Adam Smith, Varas, and Nash, and so forth, Araujo, De Bruyne are there. But there's some specificity that to have good mass of deep thinking. And that's my view. That's I want to finish that. It's not only for Brazil, but in this society here and for the whole world, I think we economists can do lots of contribution. And I'm doing that myself on a small scale in Brazil.
It gives me great pleasure to bring this conference towards its conclusion by chairing the final session of the conference. It has been a truly excellent conference, but the organisers have really excelled in finding a way to close it on a high note. I'm really very pleased to be able to chair a session by Pierre-André Chiappori. The formal introduction is going to be given in a minute by Luis Bredo. I just want to say this is going to be a highlight for me of a conference, and I'm truly looking forward to this talk. So, Luis, if you'd like to take over.
Thanks, Gareth. Sorry. I'm pleased to introduce Pierre-André. Pierre-André was my PhD advisor. Aloisio was my master advisor, so it's a very nice place to be. So Pierre-André is named professor of economics at Columbia University. It's a little bit hard to summarize his background, but let me try. He graduated from École Normale. We have just a chat yesterday, and he was telling me about the background he got at École Normale and the discussions with philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians, and few people from many areas. He did a master in mathematics at the University of Paris, and later on, doctor in economics at the University of Paris. There are other things in the middle, but I think those are like summarized his background. So general background in the beginning, and something more mathematics, finishing economics. He started his career and built most of his career in France. So if I didn't count it wrongly, you stayed at least 16 years in France after your PhD. Well, I tried to organize your contributions in 3 categories. So first papers were, it looked to me as papers on mathematical economics. So in particular, I have in mind the paper on differentiability of the demand function and papers on sunspots. Then came the widely recognized research on household decision, labor supply, and family demand. I see here many students from FGV, and they are all, at least those that I see, are familiar with your paper in econometric about testing the Isletsk metrics, symmetry of the Isletsk metrics. I'm a big fan of that work. It's one of my favorites, and I believe it's one of the favorites of many of people around here. He also started a research on doing empirical tests on moral hazard using insurance data. Again, love it. So, 1997, he joined the University of Chicago, and that was the background that brought him to Chicago. Carlos went to Chicago in 97. I went in 98. I see André, 99, I guess. So I remember students commenting on this new professor that arrived, and we were listening about him, how he has this idea of testing economic theory. This is new, this is so exciting. We've got and he's a serial theorist. I mean, and someone said, well, that's what Rob Townsend does. And I said, yeah, he's like Rob Townsend, but more micro. So I think everyone that was trained in theory and looking to do applications and at that time was very excited with your arrival and for those reasons. So during this time, you stayed short period in Chicago, unfortunately, unfortunately for Chicago and for those who love Chicago. So you did empirical tests on markets with asymmetric information, similar to those on using insurance data that was done in France. But now he started to use like dynamic data to distinguish moral hazard from other types of asymmetric information. Notice also a paper on testable implication of general equilibrium theory. I have a great story about this, but I don't want to make that too long. It's a very difficult paper on mathematical economics. And you have to take a while to see what can be tested there. But it's nice work. And then he went to Columbia University, where he is up to today. He kept studying insurance markets, household decisions, empirical general equilibrium. There is a paper with Rob Townsend, finally, on India villages. It's a recent paper. And a lot of new papers on matching and the marriage market, which I believe are going to be the topic of today's talk. So without further delay, thank you very much for being here, and it's a pleasure to